You know, God speaks to people in dreams all throughout the Bible, at different times and for different reasons. But in Genesis chapter 28, God specifically speaks to Jacob in a dream. And I'm convinced there's a deeper reason why God chooses to relay this information to Jacob in a dream at this point in Jacob's life. But you need to understand the context of this story or you might end up missing it. So does this story teach us anything particular about dreams? And if so, does this provide wisdom for our own lives when it comes to discerning if God indeed is speaking to us through a dream? Let's jump into Genesis 28 to find out. Genesis 28. To summarize this chapter, Jacob flees from his brother Esau after stealing Esau's blessing. His parents instruct him to flee to the house of Laban, and now Jacob finds himself at a place called Bethel. God is going to encounter Jacob in that place, and Jacob decides to set up a pillar to make that sacred space, to mark that sacred space, rather, where God met him. Meanwhile, Esau goes off and finds another wife from Ishmael, and things get weird. So some key words to pay attention to would be wife or wives, women, place, blessing, offspring, land, and heaven. Starting in verse 1, it says, Isaac called Jacob and blessed him, and he directed him. So the blessing here is coming through the direction, do not take a wife from the Canaanite women. Okay? So didn't Isaac already bless Jacob 3 times in the previous chapter? This time, though, Isaac knows who he's blessing. He knows it's Jacob. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful. Sounds like Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Be fruitful and multiply. God will make you fruitful and multiply you so that you may become a company of peoples, which is what happens when Jacob comes back. He ends up being a company of peoples when he goes down to Egypt. May he give the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring. So Isaac is definitely hopeful, or at least believing that the blessing of Abraham is going to fall on Jacob his son. God be with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham. So it's already given in terms of God said it's going to happen. It's going to. Nothing's going to stop that. Thus Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban, the son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother. So we see the relationship Laban has to this family. Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob, and sent him away to Padan Aram to take a wife from there. And that as he blessed him, he directed him, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. So Esau's looking at that and going, And then he's going to make a decision based off that. And when he saw that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and went to Padan Aram, Esau saw that the Canaanite women didn't please Isaac his father. Emphasis on pleasing his father. Esau went to Ishmael and took as his wife, besides the wives he already had, which are 2 Hittite women, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son. So Esau went of his own will to go and find a wife, versus Jacob, who is sent by his father. Jacob obeys. Both boys go different directions to different sides of the family. And the question I have is, what is Esau's relationship to Ishmael up to this point? How is their relationship? How well are they acquainted? How well do they know each other? Right? This becomes background information to what we're about to see transpire at Bethel with this dream Jacob has. Now remember, Jacob is escaping for his life. He's on the run. He's going to a place he's never been to. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of what ifs, a lot of unexpected things that could happen. I mean, Jacob is going to be in danger pretty much, like in danger of robbers, in danger of the elements. And there's a lot of, things that aren't for sure. A lot of questions I'm sure Jacob has. So you can just imagine Jacob's kind of emotional and mental state as he's now leaving his home and his family to go somewhere he's never been, doesn't know how it's going to work out, finds himself alone, scared for his life, fleeing, and somewhat isolated. We don't know if he goes with a caravan of people or brings any servants, but at least he's going. And that means he is vulnerable on his own. Even with some people, he's still vulnerable to, like I said, the elements, wild animals, not having food or finding water. I mean, there's a lot of variables to consider. Now Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place. Okay, and he stayed there that night because the sun had set. Right, so there's a very practical reason why Jacob picks this place. It's dark, sun's gone down. There's no indication Jacob made this decision based off any spiritual sense or guidance from God, and God said, go here. He's just working with what he's got. We're seeing a character in the Bible kind of making decisions in fight or flight mode, right? And then he ends up taking one of the stones of the place. This becomes significant. And he put it under his head and lay down in that place. Once again, an emphasis on the place, to sleep, to get some rest, to process everything that's transpired, and what he's done and the danger he's potentially in, and will he ever go back home? It's a lot of questions, I'm sure, a lot of fear and frustration and confusion. He's disoriented, and you can just imagine, right? The question is, why does he put a stone under his head? That seems unreasonable. The worst pillow choice. I don't think it's for a pillow. I think there's something else happening. But we've seen Abraham, thinking of stones. In Abraham's story, he built there are 5 different times where Abraham built an altar. And Isaac also built an altar before in chapter 26. And these altars are used to worship the Lord, mark it as sacred space. And usually these altars are made of stone, specifically uncut stones of that place. Right? So is there any dimension possibly of that going on here? I think we're about to see yes. And he dreamed. Joseph is also a dreamer, the son of Jacob. And behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. So in this place, there's a dream. What exactly is Jacob seeing in this dream? He sees a ladder. It's on the earth or the land. The top of it reaches to heaven, or that cosmic realm, the heavenly space. There are angels ascending and descending, and behold, the Lord stood above it. And God says in this dream. Now, it doesn't directly say that God gave this dream to Jacob, just that God is in the midst of it. God is speaking to him in this dream. So why does God relay this information to Jacob in a dream? Was Jacob possibly too busy and distracted to recognize and perceive the voice of God when he's awake, on the run? Is this how God stops him in his tracks and gets a clear message to him? Are we to see his dream as resulting from putting a stone under his head, or are they unrelated? Those details. And we're going to see dreams become or be a more prominent part of Jacob's story compared to Isaac's story. Isaac doesn't have any dream, right? But Abraham did in Genesis 15. In Genesis 15, when God cuts a covenant with Abraham, we see the sun go down on Abraham, just like here. Very similar story. Darkness settles. Abraham falls into a deep sleep. God gives him a vision of what's to come. And so Jacob is much more similar to Abraham in this sense, more than Isaac even is. There seems to be at least a spiritual perception between Abraham and Jacob that Isaac just doesn't seem to portray as prominently. And so we've seen this kind of thing already happen with Abraham. In Genesis 15, again, similar elements with Abraham's dream. We see the stones. Abraham builds an altar. We see God's promise for the future. We see Abraham also in a moment of crisis or transition, just like Jacob is here. We see God bring a reassuring word that speaks to that crisis or fear. We see a kind of covenant being made. But in this case with Jacob, there's no animal offering he has to bring or blood being shed. God just makes a covenant with Jacob, no conditions required. And apparently, this is all because of what Abraham has already done, so that now his descendants can benefit from the covenant God made with Abraham. Either way, all these different components of the dream, the angels, heaven, ladder on the earth, God standing above it. We're going to break this down. It just speaks of the heavenly greatness that God intends to bestow upon Jacob and his descendants, which we know mainly is Jesus. Right? So just looking at this ladder, or rather a staircase, some kind of thing that ascends from the land to the skies, God's domain. In Genesis 11, if you remember, we see mankind come together, right? And they plan, hey, let's make a tower with its top reaching to the very heavens or the skies. And that was an image or a representation of mankind's efforts in scheming and rebellion, whereas now we see what only God can do and what God's good plan is, involving something that reaches from the earth to the heavens. See, the Tower of Babel was all about ascending and becoming great on their own to reach God in their way, whereas God here in this dream and in Jesus is coming down graciously to make Jacob great, not because of Jacob's efforts, not because of what Jacob has earned, but very simply because of God's grace and promises to Abraham. So this is once again, as I've already clarified in previous videos, an inversion of the Tower of Babel story in several ways. And the angels of God are ascending and descending on it. Now this is what Jesus alludes to in John 1. When he meets Nathanael, he tells Nathanael, you're going to see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And so essentially Jesus is claiming to be the way back to the Father, the spiritual gateway between heaven and earth, where we, who are of the earth, can access God, who is of the heavens, and come into his family by being born of the Spirit. And Jesus is the way into that. Jesus is the way heaven and earth are effectually united. But the question I have is, why angels, these angelic messengers and spiritual beings? And how does Jacob know they're angels? How does he recognize them? Does he have a category for that visually? Or does he just intuitively understand these are higher spiritual beings? Like, this is fascinating. Abraham has had an encounter with spiritual beings. Isaac, not so much. And so it seems as though that kind of skipped a generation, where Abraham seems to have, and Lot, both had experiences with angels. And I want us to think about this whole ladder or staircase going up to the heavens. We are, I'm pretty sure, seeing the cosmic heavenly greatness that God intends to bestow upon Jacob and his descendants, specifically through the promised seed of the woman, Jesus, in Genesis 3. That Messiah that comes through the line of Jacob will be the vehicle of God's heavenly blessing to the earth. Right? So it's as if the ways of heaven, the blessing, the cosmic blessing of the heavens coming to the earth comes through Jesus. And then Joseph has a very similar dream later on, Jacob's son Joseph, of this cosmic power and authority where he and his brothers are each represented by a star in the heavens. And then Daniel sees the Son of Man ascending to the Ancient of Days on a cloud, which notes Jesus' position and rank in the heavens. So it's clear that this place that Jacob is in is not as common as Jacob thought. This place is a gateway or a portal between heaven and earth. It's sacred space where God meets mankind. And God meets on his terms, in his ways. And it says, behold, the Lord God stood above it and said, I am the Lord. He's above the heavens. He's above the angels. He's above the earth. The God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie right now, I will give to you and your offspring. God is making it known to Jacob, I am only getting started with you, buddy. Like, you are the guy I'm continuing this thing with. Abraham's gone. Isaac's starting to fade out of the picture. Jacob, I'm continuing this story. And all these promises I've made, I'm going to realize them through working with you and your descendants. Right? So God is making it clear, though you're on the run and confused and disoriented and fleeing for your life and not sure what's ahead, I am with you. This is like God's official introduction to Jacob. Right? Jacob is likely in his 60s or 70s, and he's just now learning who God is. This is the kind of introduction God makes when he's confirming a covenant with one of his partners. He did this with Abraham, with Isaac, and now it's Jacob's turn to carry this along. And he says, your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, east, north, and south. Notice Jacob here, when he says you, Jacob, he's referring to Jacob's offspring, which weirdly enough, Jacob's name will be changed to Israel, and that nation will be identified by that name. All the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and your offspring. So this is God being, making them fruitful and multiplying them, kind of like what we saw with the Tower of Babel, but it's kind of inverted a bit. God actually shut down their tower project at the Tower of Babel and spread them across the land with their different languages, right? But now Jacob's going to be fruitful and multiply in a positive way, not as a result of his kind of going against God's will, which is what the Tower of Babel seems to have been, this attempt to not do what God wants us to, spread and be fruitful and multiply. And so this right here, God is clarifying, this is God's answer to the Tower of Babel kind of issue. The nations have been dispersed by their languages. People are under sin, that we're in rebellion, walking out our own human plans, and we're outside of the garden, right? So part of the way God intends to bring humanity back into the life of the garden is through this family line of Abraham, which involves Jacob. God wants to bless the nations of the earth, not leave them scattered and broken. God intends to bless them through Jacob and his descendants. So God is over the cosmos. God is over the nations. He's over all spiritual beings, and he's giving a visual representation to Jacob of that authority and power. That's part of what the staircase represents, right? The staircase is the one ordained pathway from the land back to God who's in the heavens, and Jesus is going to be that way. And Jacob is going to play a part in that story. So though Jacob might feel like God's not with him and God's not in this place, and maybe I don't have a role in this story, and maybe God's done with me, or whatever he's thinking, we don't know. God answers. And he says, behold, I'm with you and will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. Right? Rebecca said, I'll call you back. God goes, for I will not leave you until I've done what I've promised you. This becomes very personal for Jacob. He's encountering the living God of his fathers in a very direct and personal way. This is his time. So in a moment of crisis and transition, Jacob might be wondering how and if he'd ever be able to come back to his family and the land. And God reassures Jacob, I'm going to make that happen, right? Rebecca said she would. No, I will. And this promised land is a huge focus of this story. His children, this land, two of the greatest blessings and promises of God. It's as if this is framed up like a mini exile. Like it's a small image of the Garden of Eden exile. We're kicked out. We're not welcome back in. There's no way back in. We're on the outside. But for Jacob, it's getting back home. Hey, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you on our website at abovereproachministry.com. Maybe you want to learn how to study the Bible. We have free Bible classes just for you. Are you maybe a newer believer? Go ahead and check out our Christianity 101 Foundations course. Maybe you hate videos. Well, we have a podcast, so you can listen to all of our messages on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Maybe you want to join or start a discussion group. Check out our map of all the current armed discussion groups all around the world. And do you maybe live near Greenville, South Carolina? If you do, you should check out our church. Visit movementchurchsc.com for more information. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, or head over to the donate page and donate through debit or credit card, PayPal, Cash App, Venmo, Patreon, or even mail a check to P.O. Box 509, Inman, South Carolina. And if you want to make a ministry connection, feel free to reach out to me on our website. All right, I know that was a lot, but I'm done. So let's get back to the video. So this is framed up kind of like a mini exile of sorts, where God promised a way back into the garden where the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. God will do it, right? And part of his plan to do that involves using Jacob. So within that greater exile story is Jacob. Now, we're cut off from the garden, the life of God. Jacob is cut off and exiled from the land that God has promised to Abraham and his descendants. And we'll see God do that later, bring Jacob back when Jacob has a large family and is slowly becoming a nation. So just as God has promised us, we're going back to Eden through the Son, Jesus. God is promising Jacob a way back. So Jacob doesn't have to wonder anymore. Jacob doesn't have to fear, what if this? God has promised, right? And he says, I will not leave you until, which sounds like God intends to leave Jacob once he brings him back, or does he? Just like God reassured Abraham of his promised son, like you will have a son, Abraham, God is reassuring Jacob, you will return, Jacob. God reassures both of them in a dream, right? By speaking to their concerns and giving them a glimpse of their future. And this also sounds like Matthew 28, where Jesus says, I'll be with you to the end of the age. I will not leave you. Right? So God is with Jacob now. Very clearly, I will not leave you. He says, I am with you, Jacob. I'm going to multiply you. You're alone, exposed to the elements and danger and robbers and wildlife. And this promise of God right now would have been incredibly timely for Jacob. Jacob now knows, I'm not just going to die out here then. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and he said, surely the Lord, I want you to catch this, is in this place. And I didn't know it. Jacob did not expect God to be here. He didn't know God was present in his life in this way, in this place, the way that God just revealed. So far in his life, Jacob hasn't necessarily seen evidence that God is in the midst of his circumstances. So God is revealing his character, his heart, and his presence to Jacob personally, so that Jacob won't just have promises and land and descendants, but Jacob can know the Lord himself, rather than just through his father or his grandfather, right? And he says, this place, God is in this place. That's a huge part of this chapter, is that phrase, this place, the stone of this place. God is in this place. Jacob left one place, and he's heading to another place filled with uncertainty and lots of variables, and in the middle of both is God. Right? Jacob's not where he was, and he's not where he's going, but God is present. God is with him in the current moment. Isaac didn't know who he blessed in the last chapter. He thought it was Esau. It ended up being Jacob. Esau apparently didn't know marrying Canaanite women didn't please his father until he overheard Rebekah talking. Now Jacob didn't know God is present. And I think that narrative pattern seems to indicate or highlight the ignorance at times and the lack of spiritual perception on the part of these men, this family God is working with. You know, was Jacob supposed to know God is here? Is he at fault for not knowing before? I don't think so. And he was afraid, which is an interesting response. And he said, how awesome is this place? So it's a kind of trembling and shock and awe. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Sounds like Eden. So this dream strikes fear into Jacob's heart, a healthy reverential fear, a holy fear of God. Think about how God came to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. God came to him in a dream and struck fear into his heart, right, by warning him. And so God does here with Jacob. But is God's dream keeping Jacob from doing something reckless and stupid? Or was this a kind of warning or a course correction? Or was Jacob planning on doing something that God is preventing by this dream? Right? This self-revelation, this encounter is keeping Jacob from doing something dumb. We don't really know. But either way, he says this is the gate of heaven. Now I just wonder, how does Jacob have a category for these two things? House of God, gate of heaven. What does he think those ideas are? You know, house of God will be become more developed later with the tabernacle and the temple, and it links us back to the Genesis story, the Garden of Eden, where God dwelt with mankind. So the gate of heaven seems similar to the house of God, but they're not the same thing, right? Gates usually emphasize the place of judgment and decision where rulers and authoritative figures come to decide what's happening in the city. It speaks of responsibility and elders and judgment and decision-making and even who gets in and out as the gates are closed. But at least Jacob is speaking of this place being where God has set up shop for the time being. And his angels, these spiritual messengers, are doing God's bidding, his service, and work on the earth, which is You might say they're being commissioned from the gates of heaven to go up and down and do what they're doing on the earth as God commands. And it's interesting that Jacob uses this language, because in Genesis 22, God actually told Abraham, I'm going to multiply your descendants to be as many as the stars of heaven, but they will be on the earth, right? But as numerous as the stars in heaven. And he promised Abraham, your descendants will possess the gates of his enemies. And I wonder, is there a possible correlation to that section in Genesis 22 here? I think there is. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head, and he set it up for a pillar. And he poured oil on the top of it. Now that's very odd, right? What was under his head is now a sacred memorial stone to mark this moment and this place as holy. But why does he pour oil on it? Usually that indicates anointing and sanctifying something, right? Lots of moments in the biblical story where things were anointed in oil. But how did he know to do this? What was this accomplishing in the mind of Jacob? See, in Genesis 35, we're going to see Jacob come back to Bethel, and he's going to end up pouring out a drink offering on a stone he sets up. And so this might be a kind of altar in the mind of Jacob, where he pours out oil as a kind of sacrifice to God in response to God's great promises. And we're going to see the altar of God's tabernacle anointed for use. Before the priests begin sacrificing on it, the altar will be anointed with oil, or with blood, I forget. Either way, this pillar is not how Jacob acquires these promises, right? But him setting up this pillar right here is his response to God's promises. And Bethel will become an important place throughout the rest of the Bible. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Why are we told what the name of the city was? Why does it matter that Jacob changed the name of that place? Maybe because God's going to change his name. Then Jacob made a vow, and he said, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. What is it that Jacob, sorry, I don't know if you guys can see that, bread. I circled bread and clothing. In the last story, what did Jacob use to deceive his father? Well, he used a meal, bread, and then he used also meat, and he used a disguise, certain garments and clothing, right? So you're starting to see the shift hopefully taking place in Jacob. Is Jacob saying, since God will do this, I'm going to respond like this? Or is it open-ended, like, if God does this, then he'll be my God? But this is about God sustaining Jacob. This is about God keeping Jacob alive till he comes back to the land like God promised. This is about God fulfilling his promises. And this is exactly what God will tell Israel in the wilderness as they're wandering before they go to the promised land. He says, look, I gave you bread and your clothing didn't wear out. I sustained you. And then he goes, if he sustains me so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then, I see this condition, then here's the result, the Lord shall be my God. Which is really odd, because it seems as though Jacob's dedication and loyalty to God is conditional. Is Jacob declaring that the Lord is his God because God's going to do this? Or is he saying, if God does this, meaning it's open-ended, then I'll make him my God? And why has Jacob not decided in his heart that the Lord is his God up to this point yet? Why is that? And then verse 22, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. Which is weird, right? But part of what it means that the Lord is Jacob's God, for Jacob, is that he's going to give a tenth of everything back to God. So where does this idea come from? We don't see that with Isaac, but we did see that with Abraham. Abraham gives a tenth to Melchizedek, this priest king. After God gives him victory, it's kind of like a free will offering that Abraham gives from the spoil of war. And this idea actually sets the tone for what we see later with God's house. How Israel, which is they're also referred to as Jacob, the nation, Israel brings a tenth of all they have to the house of God, or the tabernacle. Right? God is their king, they're a theocracy. And God doesn't tell Jacob here to give a tenth. Jacob decides in his own heart, I'm going to give a tenth. So it's not a command. It's not prescribed, it's described. And apparently, Jacob says, this pillar shall be God's house. Apparently, he's declaring the house of God is this pillar or stone. But Jacob said earlier, this place is the house of God. Now it's changed to this pillar he was sleeping on as God met him in a dream, that this pillar is the house of God. See, God has just revealed himself to Jacob so that Jacob can know him in truth and in a very personal way. And it's on this revelation that Jacob sets up a pillar as God's house. That's the basis of this decision and this house being built. And I wonder, does this have any connection to Jesus saying, on this rock I will build my church, my temple, my house? Because Peter's given a revelation of Jesus by God, and that is the bedrock of faith, and that is the foundation upon which the family of God, the church, the temple is built. Not the physical temple, the spiritual temple, the people of God. So is there any dimension of that happening here? And how does Jacob intend to treat this pillar or space as God's house later in the future? This shall be God's house. Is this the altar on which he'll make sacrifices and bring a tenth of what God has given him and give it up to God? What does Jacob intend to do later, practically, with this pillar in space? And we'll end here. This place called Bethel is in between his father's house and his uncle's house the other direction. In between is Bethel. As if what bridges the gap between Abraham's family and the rest of the nations or the world outside of Abraham's house is actually the house of God in the middle. So what bridges, what connects, what brings together the Gentile nations and Abraham's house? It's this thing called the house of God in the middle, whom Jesus will effectually be, the living temple of God. The bridge between God and man, the bridge between Gentiles and Jews, the bridge between heaven and earth. He's the way, the truth, and the life. He's the staircase and the ladder that brings heaven and earth together. He is the way. He's the gateway. And he's the only ordained path back to the Father. And does Jacob know all this? No, but we do in hindsight. And so that's what I think is being displayed here in this dream about Jacob's future descendants, ultimately Messiah. And there's a lot of Gentile connection between Abraham's house and the other Gentiles around the world, Gentiles outside of his house. How do heaven and earth come back together? How do we get back to the garden? How do Gentile and Jew come together? Well, one new humanity in this one called Jesus, who is the bridge and the way back to the Father. So in the next study, we'll jump into Genesis 29. It will be awesome. I'll see you guys there when we continue the study in Genesis, and we jump into Genesis chapter 29. Hey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more biblical content just like this. We have hundreds of videos, but you might be most interested in these ones right here. Also, visit our website for all of our free resources and classes. And thank you so much for partnering with us financially to make this ministry even possible. Keep moving towards Jesus, and I'll see you in the next video.